Today, we're going to do a longer term review of the FX2, and we're going to use the tank that my FX2 is sitting on to get an understanding of the good, the bad, and whether or not you should look at purchasing an FX2 for your next aquarium. Hello everyone, this is Bentley, and we're going to jump right into the tank that brother-in-law James did the aquascaping on and selected the plants for. I did the planting, but when we were talking, he kind of understood where things were going to end up. I just did some of the work. So we'll take a look at that tank, and I'll start talking about some of the stuff with the FX2. We'll look at the FX2 itself for a little bit, and then we'll come back to me, and we'll kind of do final thoughts and what my overall review is. Before we dive too deep in this video, I need to give you a small disclaimer. My FX2 was provided to me by Fluval. I'm allowed to keep the filter, but I was given the filter for testing purposes and to discuss the filter honestly. I'm not being paid outside of if you consider taking the filter payment. Very important to note there, but I was expressly given it with the understanding between Fluval and I that they do not get to see anything before it goes live to the public. My feedback is entirely public and will be entirely honest to my experience, and they were okay with that. So kudos to them, I guess. Thanks to them as well for letting me play around with the FX2. And now let's get into the review. So here we are at the tank that brother-in-law James scaped and selected plants for. And you can kind of see I've got some food floating around in there. We might have to do an extra pinch. I realized that I started filming this, had some camera settings that might have made it hard to see everything, so kind of on take two. So I'll put a little food in, just a tiny touch. And that might help you see the flow pattern in this tank, and more importantly, see how fast the water moves. You can kind of see these little particulates right here, right? They hit the flow and they kind of jet over, and then they chill a little bit as they're starting to slowly move toward the back of the tank and then cycle back around, right? There's kind of a little tornado thing going on. There's a small group of Florida flagfish in here that help me control some algae. Now I'm getting small bits of blackbeard down in here and over here, but that's just part of the game, right? So they're kind of the initial fish that have helped seed this thing. And we'll be ready for real fish in a minute, but let's talk about the FX2 for a sec. This is at about 50% or so, because you can use the gate valves as long as you're at 50% or higher. Fluval has stated that the pump should not receive any damage from turning it down some. And you can see this is at 50-55% or so, maybe 60. It's a little hard to perfectly gauge it, but you can see how much movement there is. And you can even see, if you look at the Florida flags that are in here at the tank, kind of back behind the sword and stuff, they're putting in a little bit of work to keep themselves in, but nothing too crazy. They're used to some river movement. However, there's not a lot of safe place in here if you had a fish that was not tolerant to flow. So if you had a longer fin betta, think something that's got the moon tails or stuff like that, or you were dealing with guppies, as an example, this would not be a filter for you. There's too much flow. You'd have to have a much larger tank than a 40-gallon breeder. And originally, my suspicion was that this would be great for 40-gallon breeder because it's not quite as aggressive as a pump as the FX4 and FX6 has. This is where I think the next major upgrade for Fluval could be, and kind of my biggest critique of Fluval in general compared to some of the other brands that are out there in their more modern approaches to new filters. Give us a DC controllable pump. You make phenomenal pumps, but if you had this thing DC controllable, it would make this filter so much more appealing to a lot of people. And I think the FX series in general, this is your top of the line series. They are kind of expensive filters. At this point, I would almost think a DC controllable pump would be the norm, because then we could combine the DC controller with the gate valve to reduce flow and potentially make it really, really handy for a much more flexible range of fish keeping. Where I would say in this case, there's not so much flow that it's overbearing, but if I crank it to 100%, let me do that real fast. Right? I'll open the gate all the way. And it's a little hard to see because you're not looking at the top of the water, but I think you can kind of see that little piece of algae that's coming off of the spray bar over there. You know, it is a significant increase, but not so much where you're like, oh, that 50% less is really doing a lot of work. There's still quite a lot of movement in the water, even at 50%. And so if we let that, you can just kind of watch how fast the flake comes by, those little particulates. I know it's a little tough, but watch the plant movement is the other thing. You see those crypts in the back or the sword there and how much it's wavering. Now we'll dial it back down to where it was. And you can see the difference is kind of minimal. I mean, there is a difference, yes, but you're still at a pretty reasonable flow rate to make sure that you're not risking damaging the motor. And that's one of the things where I think like Fluval could improve on this. And if you're spending this kind of money, especially if you're doing it on something like a 40-gallon breeder like this, you probably want to look at a different filter, honestly, unless you're trying to get something that is a bit more like stream system, river system, higher flow rate, which is what we're targeting in this tank, which is part of why it will work for us, is we're going to do fish that do like a little bit more flow. But if you were trying to do some of the angelfish that are out there, you know, bettas, a lot of your gouramis, a lot of your fish that don't like high flow, this could be potentially a disaster for you. So that would be the one thing I would caution you on with an FX2 is make sure that you're putting it on either a significantly larger tank, like a 75-gallon at a minimum. You might even need to look at something a bit larger. Or if you're building your hardscape up and you have like big areas that go quite high and not low like this, to block the flow in some places to make resting areas. Like if you look kind of over there to the left of the sword, you can see like there is kind of a lesser flow area being protected somewhat. And if we were to watch these Florida flagfish for a long period of time, you would see when they're in rest mode, that's where they hide. But when they're doing their normal swim pattern, they don't mind the flow too much. But you can definitely see, if you watch the big guy who's right there in the middle, he's moving his fins quite a bit to stay hovering there. He's putting in some effort. So he's burning some calories, right? It means he needs a little extra food. But they've got lots of algae. Plus, I feed them a little bit every day. So that's been doing good. They were quite a bit smaller, although that one big male has definitely put on some good body size. So that's what we're looking at with the tank. I'll actually take you to take a look at the filter itself, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. All right, I know my fish room's a little bit of a mess. I've been doing some organizing and moving stuff around. The work schedule messed with it, but you can see like little particles of fish food and stuff that have fallen out of my fingers when I've been grabbing pinches and stuff. But, you know, when you're looking at this gate here, right, that's how we're controlling our flow, and that's about it. And if you were to tamper down the in, it really won't help you all that much. It's purely tampering down the outlet. And, I mean, you saw up here in the tank, that difference is pretty minimal. So I don't know. I feel like there's something that Fluval could do to make it better. So we've looked at the filter, we've looked at the tank. Let's talk about like the real breakdown of whether or not this is a filter you should look at, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't had a really big fish load in that tank, but what I will say is that, like every other FX, it's a very, very durable and effective filter. One of the things that's really nice about FXs is because they have larger open intakes and it is kind of a big, large bit of sponge and media inside those trays, you can go a lot longer without maintaining them. I haven't done a single maintenance that thing yet, and realistically, I probably won't need to for probably at least another 3 months. Having said that, I have pulled it apart and messed with it so you understand what a maintenance is like. And like a lot of other FX filters, it's a little bit of work, but because of that smaller body, it doesn't hold quite as much water. The trays are a little more compact, but they still hold a relatively similar amount of media. You're just missing some extra plastic. It actually makes that filter, even full of water, quite a bit lighter. So doing that maintenance, honestly, is a little bit easier. One thing that I think Fluval definitely could learn from the Eheims of the world and a few other filters that use their Quick Connect system is a Quick Connect. While those gate valves that sit on the top that we can use to control can be used to completely shut off water, you still have a propensity when you're doing service to, when you take those off the top, a kind of a blop of water to come out of your filter itself because of the pressure that it gets under. And I haven't found a really good way to prevent that in any of my FX filters. Now granted, is that a lot of water? No, not really, but it's a little annoying. If you have a good way to fix that, let me know in the comments down below. But unlike, say, the Awaze or some of the other filters, even when you're cleaning the pre-filter on the Awaze especially, there's kind of an order of operations and a little wait time you can do that minimizes or completely prevents that from occurring. In the case of the Awaze, it's completely prevent. Where in like the quick connects that are used in like the F-Zone Fancy Boy, the AstroStream, all the classic Eheim filters, when you gate it at 2 places, you have just a tiny amount of water in between those gates that, yeah, that's going to spill. But it's such a small amount of water that you could literally get like a small towel and wrap around as you're opening it up, and it would probably soak up everything. Whereas there's a bit more water coming out of the FX6, 4, and 2 whenever you take those gate valves off the top. Now, granted, those gate valves are part of why it reprimes itself so well, because it holds all that water, it creates natural suction and gravity. As you open those gate valves back up and you turn everything back on, that's great. It makes repriming your filter that fast, right? It's a breeze. But for some of us, it's a pain point. Especially, I think, if you like had an aquarium where you were going to be on carpet, you would probably have to take some extra steps to make sure you weren't spilling a little bit of water on your carpet. And I say little bit, but like we all know, filter water don't smell good, right? So you don't want that getting into your carpet, getting screamed at by your spouse, or maybe having a cat or a dog get into it weirdly, or just even bothering yourself, right? It's one of those things where I think these are improvements that Fluval could look at. Their gate valves themselves are really tough and really durable, which is great for their purpose, which is restricting your flow down. That actually works really, really well, but it only impacts it so much. Again, this is where I talked about a DC controllable pump, and I think that would be really the biggest upgrade to any of the FX filters in general, is because we have that external pump on the back of the housing, the extra cable for a DC controllable pump and having a little thing that just mounts to the filter itself to control it, or could mount anywhere else if the cables are long enough, similar to how the F-Zone AstroStream has a DC controllable pump with a controller on it, could be so beneficial. And if you could control flow rate, it would add a significant amount of versatility and flexibility to that filter to allow it to be used in many, many more applications. As long as the flow is not a problem, right? If you're doing something with Danios, Tetras, rainbow fish, obviously this idiot, or maybe even plecos where they actually appreciate that extra flow, it's actually a pretty great filter. Where you run some risk is because it does have that large intake. If you're trying to do like a breeding tank, I wouldn't, right? Because you've got a risk of fry. Now, granted, there is a sponge kit you can get. I think it's an Etsy thing, but they might sell them themselves. I will correct myself right here. But that can put sponge inside of there. You would just have to maintenance that significantly more often than not having it, but it now gives you an intake sponge as well, which will minimize some of your maintenance on the large filter itself, because you could just easily, once a week, once every 2 weeks, whatever it takes, open that up, because it's fairly easy to open, get the sponge out, clean it out real fast, plug it back in, call it a day. There's also lots of Etsy replacements that change the intake itself into a different format that makes it easier to put something like an intake sponge on. For those of us who use intake sponges on like every hang-on back known to man, and we don't care what they look like, that might be another option for you. My last thing is this. The biggest benefit to the FX2 is that it can fit in places where the FX4 couldn't. But otherwise, it is basically an FX4. The pump is not exactly the same. It's a little bit smaller. It's a little bit less powerful, but it's basically the exact same filter. In a slightly smaller form factor, it has the same amount of media that it can hold between the sponges and physical media space in the trays. So it is basically just a baby FX4 in mostly name. In power, it's almost exactly the same, but because it has that much smaller body, it can fit into smaller spaces. My racks that you see that thing, that FX2 fits completely under my racks. I could not fit an FX4 under there without doing some like weird shenanigans to get it under in the first place. And it's by very little. I want to be very clear about that. It's by the tiny amount of clearance. But I cannot get a 4 or a 6 under there. I can get the FX2 under there. The F-Zone AstroStream cannot fit under there at all. It's too freaking tall. So that is one of the benefits. One of the main design things that Fluval was targeting was building an FX filter that is designed to fit in smaller spaces so that people could use an FX-style filter on some of their tanks that are in a display cabinet or in a racking system like this, and be able to have an FX filter in a smaller, more contained space. In that case, I think they're winning as far as what their goal was. The real question is, why would you still go with an FX2 over a 407? And my answer to you is this. Honestly, other than you really like the FX form factor, or maybe you like the particular FX pumps because they are a little bit better pumped than what is in the 4.0 series or the 07 series. Sorry, the 07 series. But as far as like amount of media it holds, effectively speaking, its water capacity, its XYZ, right? Pump. They're so similar, and very often the 407 is a much cheaper filter to buy. And because it is a much thinner body, you can fit it into a lot of spaces that you couldn't fit the FX2 into because of its circumference, right? It is still kind of like a mini trash can that you're using for a filter. The only major difference is the FX4 is a bit taller. Or not the FX4. The 407 is a bit taller. The FX4. Oh, Bentley, you're failing at life. So what's the end result here? Should you buy an FX2? Maybe. Honestly, I like it a lot. I'm enjoying it on the tank it is, and for my purposes, it's going to be great long term. But for the amount of money it costs, granted, I'm lucky, I got mine for free. I need to state this multiple times. I did get the FX2. It was given to me for testing and doing video purposes from Fluval, and I do get to keep the filter. I need to be really, really specific about that. Probably need that in the intro. We'll film it in the intro. So you saw it already, but you know. Anyway, but that being said, like, I still think there's room to be critical, room for improvement. It's not perfect, but no filter really is. It's just, as long as you select your filter for the right reasons, and not just because it's like, oh, it's an FX, or oh, it's an Eheim, or oh, it's an X. If you know that, like, hey, I need stronger flow, I would like something that does have a spray bar potentially, or I don't want a spray bar at all, I want that stronger jet at the top. The FX2 is actually a great filter for those purposes, but if you need something that is not quite as intense, or you need something that's easier to maintenance because you intend to do maintenance more frequently, you might want to look at a different filter in that price range. Potentially one of the Awases. You might look at something like an Eheim, although they are kind of similar in that they're a little bit of a bear to work on sometimes. Those quick connects make some of their maintenance a lot easier, and because they do come in smaller sizes, they're a little easier to service. Realistically, the side handles on that thing actually make it pretty easy to service. So I don't know, pick your poison. If I was doing this tank from scratch again, would I use the FX2? No, I wouldn't. Because I think I would have less potential limitations on stocking or a few other things when it comes to working on the tank itself if I went with a different filtration system entirely. And what I mean is basically not a canister. I think because of my racking, the FX2 is actually a pretty good canister to be using. But if I was doing this over again, or I was someone who was going to try and have this for a long term and lots of different tanks in racks, I would either A, look at something like a sump if I'm going to go that route because maintenancing sumps is significantly faster, or B, I would probably look at a hang-on back. I think that's just my 2 cents. Mostly on the sense of if you want to, there's a cost versus what you're getting, and I feel like that FX2 quite hasn't hit the right mark yet. I feel like they could make improvements to it to get it there. I do know that there are some other attachments that you can get for it that are like some interesting changes you can do to that. Like the spray bar actually makes it a lot better, in my opinion, than the normal like 2-jet system, because I can disperse that flow out a little bit, and it actually makes it feasible on a 40-gallon breeder to create a higher flow tank. But if I didn't have that, I probably would have a much lower opinion of the filter, to be honest. So that's it. Let me know in the comments down below. Have you purchased an FX2? Have you been looking at an FX2? What are your thoughts now, whether you've used it or whether you've gotten my feedback and experience? I'm still going to be running this filter for quite a while. I'll probably do some extra videos later on where I compare a few other filters over time. But in general, pretty good. Not amazing. It's like one of those things where it's like, in all the options I have for a canister filter at that price point, is that the one I would choose every time? No. Plain and simple. Is there one that I could tell you right now that I would choose every time? No, because I think most filters, you need to know what you're trying to do with that tank and then select a filter, rather than go, I'm just going to use this filter on everything. That's my thoughts. Other than that, if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've ever thought that someone else was asking about an FX2, something like that, consider sharing this video. It's one of the best ways to help us small YouTubers kind of get our word out, get a little love, and tell like grand algorithmic god YouTube like, hey, I like this stuff and maybe someone else will too. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.